The wise have said that strange are the ways of the Lord. If you just look at nature, which is nothing but a frontal projection, nature in its present movement is nothing but a frontal projection, a surface movement of a vast supernature. Even in that, if you just observe it, it's truly very amazing how it works. It picks up one line, develops it, and drops it suddenly. Picks up another line, develops it to its own perfection, drops the second line. Picks up a third one, develops it, drops that. And in the fourth one, very rapidly, summarizes the past three lines which it has dropped, takes them together, integrates, harmonizes, and leads them to a much greater perfection. This is the way evolution proceeds, always. We can have a quick look at the summary, in a summary way, of the appearance of man. We see how in fish, nature has perfected the movement of life in water. Everything of fish it's a whole world. It's amazing. It's a much bigger world than what exists on land. 3/4 is water. And all size and shapes and colors of fishes perfected. And suddenly when nature has to evolve to the next level, completely that is lost. The more evolved being suddenly steps onto the land and runs there, very competent on the land, but is unable to breathe inside water. It's unable to do anything inside water except perhaps to keep itself afloat and swim. Then nature intends to fly. So all the ability to run and crawl, all this is lost. And the bird begins to fly. And when this bird has to change into a shape of a mammal, it loses its wings, its ability to fly, and begins to run and jump and prowl. Was it a waste? Was it a loss? We may think that, but there is a deep wisdom that works in nature. Aurobindo reminds us, Pragya Prasrata Purano, the ancient of the days has gone forth in his deep wisdom into this world. And it is he who is here, and it is he who creates. And of course, it is he who absorbs everything back unto himself. And so we see in man, suddenly, seemingly neither competent as the bird to fly or to breathe in water or to run like an animal, yet all these three awaken in man as a memory of some bygone past. So man wishes to conquer the sea like the fish, but conquers it in his own unique way. Ships sail, and they sail from one coast to far off coasts, carrying goods which a fish could never imagine. A fish could at the most move itself from one little spot of water to another. But the dream of the fish, or the perfection of the fish, or the memory of the fish state awakens in man and perfects another kind of movement. The memory of the bird, the possibility of the bird, manifests in man in a way that is unprecedented. A bird can move from one forest to another. Sometimes they migrate from one distant land to another. But human beings can fly from, nowadays probably from Earth to planet Mars. This is the possibility of that flying which nature has created, has manifested in another way through a human matter interaction. The same thing we find in human consciousness and its development, because we are often bewildered by appearances. The fish would have been bewildered by the loss of all the fish abilities, that what is nature intending? And so too the reptiles would have been bewildered by the loss of 100, 1,000 little legs by which a reptile can crawl very fast and swift in the forest. And the bird would have been bewildered by the loss of its wings, and perhaps the monkey by its tail, and man by his reason. And yet, nature does this marvel, picks up all these threads it has left aside and integrates into something higher. How does it work in man? In man, we see for a long time two tendencies which seem to be opposing each other. Last time we spoke about little bit, we read rather about the individual and the collective. These two conditions must meet. And always in human evolution, we see these two tendencies in human nature. One, extremely living only for self, what is called as selfishness. So much so that it's almost regarded as selfishness is the second nature of man. Aurobindo says this is the only sin and evil. Selfishness and meanness are the only sin and evil. And then he says, of course, yet these two must be pardoned because they are universal. So this selfishness, extreme selfishness, on one side we have this tendency in man. Everything he wants for himself. He is a little center, nebula of the constituent stars. That's how Aurobindo describes in Savitri. Most of us like to be as a human race, each individual, and he will find his own little stars. Look at a house or a family, how it organizes itself. On the other hand, every human being has in him a tendency for group life. It's so difficult for human beings to live only alone and by itself. The individual life and the group life often seems to be contradicting each other, and yet man has to harmonize it. It's very interesting that till almost maybe the beginning of previous century or even till the middle of it, we see that the individual life was largely, at least in the recent history, largely a projection of the collective life. An individual usually was a variant of the group to which he belonged. And his variations were allowed only to the extent that he conformed to the group. He was not supposed to totally go out of the pale of the group identity. His individuality was allowed only as long as it did not contradict some of the fundamental principles of group life. It could be any group. It could be a religious group, it could be a social group, it could be a cultural type, or at the most a national identity, which of course is relatively later. Or still earlier, if you see the tribe, the clan. In fact, the Gita starts with this difficult question. Arjuna, who is an individual, raises this question: if you have this war, what happens to the tribe? What happens to the clan? What happens to the social values? They are all going to be destroyed. So Krishna tells him, don't worry, this is my old game. I destroy and I rebuild. And when I rebuild, it's something much better than what is destroyed. So don't worry about it. Krishna assures him. And this is precisely what we find, that this individual and the social, both nothing but a shadow of some deeper reality. The individual, as we understand in the last, at least last few centuries, is nothing but a ego individuality. He wants things for himself, and it's difficult for him to harmonize with the group life. The group itself is a collective ego, decided and determined by certain patterns of thought, certain beliefs, certain customs, certain ways of living, almost certain habitual ways of thinking and responding and reacting to life. This is not conducive to a further evolution. So what nature does, or rather one suspects the wisdom that is hidden behind nature, how it works, it tries to break both. It's so difficult now to find that old social prototype of a group. It's very difficult. There is no society which is now, which can be called as a pure social type of the past. There is no nation of which it could be said that it's a pure nationality. There is no group identity which is completely conforming to the pattern which nature had created. And we also find that the individual is no more a little projection of the group life. He's struggling to find his own individual identity, which is independent of all group identities. Very, very interesting the way nature is working. And this is a very, very important task which nature is performing with great labor and pain. And where was it initiated? Of course here. We read the other day, the mother says that how she used to, earlier days, she says the ashram was a collection of individualities. And to create this individuality, all kinds of means were adopted, to the extent that an individual had to be, this is one of the challenges, that the individual has to, reject what he doesn't want to accept, the mobile tune and music, and yet continue. This is one of the challenges of an individual formation. So in the formation of an individual identity, this is the method which is adopted. That suddenly out of the group, an individual or a few individuals begin to break free, and they think for themselves, they want to feel for themselves. They have their own personal opinions, personal views, personal ways of looking at things, which many times contradict the social views. And here in the ashram, she started by each individual had to be, in a way, isolated in himself. We read the other day, I think the very second or third of this series, where the mother says that each of you were an individual. And they were kept separate. And that's why we see it so interesting that each one, though, has the same central pivot, mother and love for her. And yet each one is so unique. All the names, the great ones who have been the pioneers of this work, each one is unique, and each one has the same center around which he organizes himself. So the present task that nature has taken is the formation of an individual. It's very strange that to create an individual, one needs the ego. Without the ego, there can be no individuality. And the same ego becomes a bar when he has to turn towards a higher life. So someone asked the mother, why create it at all? The same way, why nature creates something and after some time it says you have to leave it aside. So the mother says very beautifully, my child, it's like a mold. So we must have a mold. When a mold is there, things are poured, and over a period of time they begin to crystallize, like we make ice cream. It's poured into a mold and then crystallizes. So we have different types of ice cream, pista ice cream, mango ice cream, and they are all ice cream. But each becomes a type of ice cream. It's a mold in which one pours. Otherwise there will be mixture and confusion. So to create separate molds, nature creates a formation of the ego, within which for many births, the sleeping spark, the divine spark, the psychic spark, it must develop from life to life within this mold. It comes into this mold, takes a certain experience, and develops a certain kind of distinct individual soul identity. It's something very beautiful, very interesting. The Kathopanishad describes it in very beautiful way in one of its cryptic series of verses. Agnir yathaiko bhuvanam pravishto rupam pratirupo babhuva eko sthita sarva bhutantaratma rupam pratirupo bahishcha. As the fire enters into a mold and assumes the shape of the mold, so there is one soul or one self that enters into each mold and becomes as if an individual. Then again it gives another example, Vayur yathaiko bhuvanam pravishto rupam pratirupo babhuva eko sthita sarva bhutantaratma rupam pratirupo bahishcha. And then it says, even though it enters the mold, takes the experience, becomes an individual entity, yet behind it remains the universal. Again we see hints at a new kind of process that evolution will adapt to create a new kind of harmony between the individual and the collective. Right now there is no harmony. There is adjustment and association. Because at the level of the ego, it's just not possible It's possible to have association, it's possible to have adjustment, it's possible to have compromise, it's possible to have conflict, conceding, war, strife, and all the rest, but no true harmony. But here there is another hint. Suryo yatha sarva lokasya chakshu nalipyate chakshushe bahya dosha eko vashi sarva bhutantaratma nalipyate lok dukkhena bahyat. Just as the sun stands above this creation, illumining all the worlds, and yet is unaffected by the events and happenings there, so there is the one self of all beings who is unaffected, unafflicted by all the good, bad, evil, beauty, ugliness that goes on inside the womb of nature. And then it goes still further. Eko vashi sarva bhutantaratma eko bahunam yo vidadati kaman tam atmastham yenu pashyanti dhira stesham sukham shashwati neteresham nityo nityanam chetanash chetananam. Actually, it's a very beautiful lyrical, musical poetry. Nityo nityanam chetanash chetananam eko bahunam yo vidadati kaman tam atmastham yenu pashyanti dhira stesham shantim shashwati netaresham. That it is the one who has become many, basically it's that. And who sees these many? Who has become dhir. He discovers the eternal joy and the eternal bliss and the eternal peace that resides in the self. But this is not our normal experience of individuality and collectivity. Our normal experience today is an ego individuality and the collective ego. The collective ego tries to immolate the individual ego on the altar of its collectivity. The individual is formed precisely by that conflict. If the society and the individual were not going to come into conflict with each other, there would be no ego individuality. It's very interesting that the conflict is used for a greater purpose. There was some very small, one of those cards where you have those inscriptions. I had read a very interesting inscription. The most precious stones are formed when all the waves leap upon it. They are tossed by the sea, thrown by the winds, and they are shaped by life's most difficult storms. We see some beautiful shells, which are sold, and we don't realize that how they are formed. So many imprints are needed to create a very, very exquisitely beautiful shell. A shell that doesn't receive many imprints and is thrown on the shore very soon, that's why shells which are found, easily on the surface don't carry that beauty. But if one goes a little deeper and picks up, they are really shaped by all the forces that are hurtled against it. So when we see on the surface the conflict between individual and society, we lose hope and courage. But actually this is the process, this is the path. And that's why today we have the children who just don't want to accept anything on the basis of external authority or on the basis of social norms and social modes or custom and tradition. They just don't accept. If we tell them this is what will society say? They will say, let it say what it wants to say. Each one is almost like a little Vivekananda. When Vivekananda was told, after he gave a talk, they asked Vivekananda, sir, you have given this idea of Vedanta, but Shankaracharya says something else. Vivekananda said, yes, but I, Vivekananda, say this. One may interpret it as egoism. It's not egoism. It looks like that. It's based on the deeper self-discovery. This is the truth of my experience. I have to stand by the truth of my experience. I have to follow my own line of evolution. This is what nature is now creating. It was so difficult earlier. It was, even the individual was like a prototype of a group. He was a seeker after knowledge because he was born in a family of pot-bellied and, greedy Brahmins. So he became a Brahmin by birth. He became a warrior simply because he was born with a surname. Even though he was trembling in face of war, would want to run away. Now that is gone. The individual carries a line of evolution and each life gives it a certain evolution to form this mold. Mother gives a very beautiful example. She says that it's like if somebody has to grow along the lines of nobility and courage, then what does he do? he takes birth as a king. And then she gives an example. Now, a king, for all the luxury he enjoys, he cannot afford to look weak. Even if he is afraid and scared, when there is an actual war, a king cannot say, no, I am scared and afraid. Of course, there are kings who have done that. King has to pick up the sword. He has to take the side. He has to take a stand and stand by that, even if it means loss of his own life. So she says he takes that experience along with him. And then, of course, she gives the example, the famous, well-known example of Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth I, which possibly we believe, I am told that she was herself, King Elizabeth I was one of her own vibhutis. Now we see in the life of Queen Elizabeth, she says what kind of life it is. One would say it's a very nice life to be a queen. But she is on her deathbed and there is a problem of taxation and the farmers come and they want to discuss with her. And she gets up to solve their problem. And all her attendants tell her, no, but you know, it's dangerous. You are on the deathbed. You can't get up and talk and solve their problem. And Elizabeth remarks, no, but death can wait. Death can wait. This is important. Now that experience goes into the making in future of someone for whom death can really wait. Because she has gone through that experience, that intense experience. So each life is an experience to pursue a certain line of evolution till the psychic spark which is cradled inside the womb. All this universal nature is like a womb wherein the psychic spark is being developed through all the experiences. For a long time, these experiences come through the mass. But a time comes when this little spark begins to assert itself and its shadow falls upon nature and begins to crystallize as an ego individuality. And that is why we find, much to our discomfort, that people who take to yoga are often terribly egoistic. The reason is that the ego has to develop to a point where it is ready to dissolve. If the ego is not developed, if the individual is still not really an individual but a mass of vibrations, one is not really ready for the great adventure. That is why in the Indian myth you have Krishna born in the prison of Kansa. This prison is the prison of ego, out of which the baby emerges. Now why should nature do it? Why doesn't it carry the whole universal humanity together? So the mother explains, it does this because in animal it has done this way. There is nothing like an individuality of a lion. There is no individual lion. Even when it is in the zoo, it is still a non-vegetarian lion. It does not become a different individual. In human beings, nature wants to make the process very rapid. So the only way it can make it rapid is that out of the universal mass, some individualities arise. So in the individual, nature exceeds herself beyond the collectivity. That's why Mother says always the individual is ahead of the collective. And she gives that famous example of the charity bazaar, where a fire breaks out. Before the fire, everybody is gentlemen, dressed up in nice suits, talking nice things. But when the fire breaks out, she says, she saw, what an amazing thing. Men were pushing the ladies away so that they can rush out and escape. All the gentlemanly things and the beautiful things they were saying collapsed. Because in the mass, in a crowd, a human being belongs to the mass. But in some people, it is creating an individuality. Unfortunately, these people are regarded in society and in their families as black sheep. But these black sheep are actually the would-be white sheep. This is the process. Because individual has to break free from the social mold, and then nature can exceed in him, hasten and quicken the pace of evolution, and then only he can arrive at a point where he can say, now I give myself to you. Before one can give oneself, Mother says, you must have something to give. If you have nothing, you can give nothing. And this is the passage which we can read. Somebody has probably asked the question. Mother is saying, certainly if one were to lose one's ego too soon, From the vital and mental point of view, one would again become an amorphous mass. So too soon losing is also not allowed. Right moment. Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa used to say, Kacha ami, Paka ami. There are two ways of course, interpreting it. One is the unripe I, ami, and the ripe I. But I didn't know it. I used to always interpret it in a way which I feel is also equally okay. The kacha am and the pakka am, the raw mango and the ripe mango. The raw mango is only good for making pickles. But the ripe mango, you can make many things. Ice cream, you can eat it like that, you can make it into amras and mango shake and all kinds of things, So this is the pakka am and the kacha am. So she's saying, if you lose it too prematurely, it's not allowed. The ego is surely the instrument for individualization. That is, until one is an individualized being, constituted in himself, the ego is an absolutely necessary factor. If one had the power of abolishing the ego ahead of time, one would lose one's individuality. But once the individuality has been formed, the ego becomes not only useless but harmful. So it's just a question of where one stands. And only then comes the time when it must be abolished. But naturally, as it has taken so much trouble to build you, it does not give up its work so easily. Nature has taken quite a few births to create an ego individuality. And it's only recently, as I said, in the last few decades that we find distinct ego individualities coming up. So therefore we find friction between the individual and the society. Earlier it was not there as something common. It was a rare exception. Now it is becoming more common. It is exception to the rule that a person is being a conformist. It's more common that a person is revolting against the society. In fact, in one of the places, the mother says, if you still have social ways of thinking, you are not yet ready for stepping into this yoga. So here she is saying, merge one's ego in the divine! Exclamation. But first, one can't merge one's ego in the divine before becoming completely individualized. Do you know what it means to be completely individualized? Capable of resisting all outward influences. Somebody who can be one's own self in the middle of a crowd. One is absolutely unaffected. And that's what we find one of those examples where I think it's there in Champaklal's Treasures, where he was given the work of making some box and someone stepped out and said it was, I think, story of the guest house. That look, when you don't do it this time because I'm meditating and it's disturbing my meditation. So Champaklalji reported this to the mother. What do I do? You have asked me to make a box, it's disturbing someone's meditation. Mother says, you continue the work, he does not know how to meditate. He who knows to meditate can meditate in a battlefield. That's what the message of the Gita is. So this is possible only after an individuality is formed. Some days ago, I received a letter from someone who told me that he was very hesitant about reading books of ordinary literature. For example, novels or dramas, because his nature had an almost insuperable tendency to receive imprints of the characters in these books. There are many more people than one would think who are like that. So most of us are still like a mass. Whatever we receive from outside, we are influenced. And that's why for a long time in yoga, till ego individuality is being formed, it's important to probably impose external rules. But after a while, it becomes unnecessary because the mold is ready. And whatever one reads, thinks, it doesn't matter because one has a very formed individuality and everything is filtered through that. So here she is saying, now everything is a thumb, an expressed thought, a sentence read, an object looked at, an observation of what someone else does, and of one's neighbor's will. And all these wills, when one sees them, they are all there like this intermingled. Each one trying to get the uppermost and causing a kind of perpetual conflict within, outside. So one is tossed like a cork on the waves of the sea. And it's so common when we look at any discussion. It starts from one topic, from the most spiritual ends up with the most mundane, because we are tossed by waves, currents, thoughts, desires, everything streams inside. She says, in fact, it's only because of the body that you have a feeling that we are individuals. Sometimes it's only a name. We are so attached to the name that if the name is misspelled, we feel that our own identity is threatened. Of course, a name is little better than surname, but there is no other identity. Now here she says, this is when we are like an amorphous mass. Other than that, we understand nothing of ourselves. So what is an individuality? She says, first one must become a conscious, well-knit, individualized being who exists in himself, by himself, independently of all his surroundings. It doesn't matter where one is. One thinks what one wants to think. One does what one must do, irrespective of the society, irrespective of the surroundings. If one believes that this should be done, one does that. Even if everybody says, this is not the right thing to do, you are contradicting a social custom, you are being asocial, none of these things matter to an individual. Naturally, he or she would look like a terribly egoistic person. He receives from outside only what he wants to receive. He automatically refuses all that is not in conformity with his plan, and nothing can leave an imprint in him unless he agrees to receive the imprint. Then one begins to become an individuality. When one is an individuality, one can make an offering of it. So, we often talk about offering, surrender, self-giving. So Mother says, for unless one possesses something, one cannot give it. First one must be, and then afterwards one can give oneself. So for a long time in inner life, through many lifetimes, nature, through all the experiences, we want to give ourselves, but it first creates an individual. And often people wonder, even oneself wondered, I want to give myself from the divine. What is it I am becoming more and more egoistic? But actually that is the path. It says you want to give yourself to the divine? Fine. I will give you something which you can give. It's like when we were little children, then, parents, even now they do it, when you do an offering. So parents, when rich parents come with their little children, they take out some money and give it to the child, and through the hand of the child the offering is put. It's all right, but it's not the child's own offering. It's something which the child has to do mechanically. It's the parents offering through the child. It's quite different when the child grows up and the child decides to give. Maybe when he grows up, he doesn't want to part even with a penny. I had an interesting experience when somebody, I went to a shop and this person had kept one in a very obscure place. Very interesting experience, where picture of Mother and Sri Aurobindo signed photographs were with the shop owner, and he asked me, do you want these photographs? I couldn't imagine, this place nobody knows about Mother and Sri Aurobindo. So I was very touched. I said, of course, and I was, of course, having some kind of aspiration. And I asked him, how did you get them? So he said, no, some family came from place X, and they, their parents had this photograph. So they told me that, we want to put, use these frames, and can you put our pictures, mine and my wife's picture, in these frames? So he said, of course, what do I do with the photographs? He said, they are of no use to me, you can do what you like. And then this man knew me and knew my affiliation with the ashram. Of course, his mother's grace, tremendous grace. So he thinks of me and keeps the photographs for 3-4 months. Now can we imagine that somebody would dispose of Mother and Sri Aurobindo's signed photographs, and in those frames, but wants to keep the frame nevertheless, and wants to put his own and his wife's picture in those frames? And people do it. Now naturally this person's, he asked, how come you got them? It was his parents. So parents as children must have, talked about, he must have grown up in Mother and Sri Aurobindo's thought. But when he grows up, he has to make a choice. And that choice is the choice of the individual. It's not enough that one does it mechanically. Nature does not allow that. So here, she's saying, unless one possesses something, one cannot give it. So long as one does not exist, and can give nothing, one can give nothing, and for the separative ego to disappear, as you say, one must be able to give oneself entirely, totally, without reservation. And then she puts a rider, and to be able to give oneself, one must first exist. And to exist, one must be individualized. So this is the whole drama that nature is playing. And behind the scenes, we look at the conflict between individual and society, but it's just a shadow boxing. Behind, there is the true individual and the true collective soul which is developing, waiting for their hour. When the time comes, it will slip off, and the individual soul, discovering itself, will also discover the universal self of all beings and harmonize itself in the most beautiful and unexpected ways. For darkness and darkness fail. What is that line? And darkness slipped like a failing cloak from the reclining body of a god. So that's how this darkness will slip off, and we will discover Agnir yathaiko bhuvanam pravishto rupam rupam pratirupo babhuvo eko sthita sarva bhutantaratma rupam rupam pratirupo bahishya. And then simultaneously the other truth. This is the truth of the individuality and the other truth, which are not cancelling each other, but they harmonize and complement each other. In our life they cancel each other, and therefore we cannot harmonize. The individual cannot harmonize with the group as long as he lives in the ego and the ignorance. The only way is to discover that other truth. Suryo yatha sarva lokasya chakshu nalipyate chakshushe bahya dosha eko vashi sarva bhutantaratma nalipyate lok dukkhena bahyat.